Hello again, everyone. I'm here with another travel palette swatching video. This particular palette I have shown before. I will put a link to the video where I talk about this palette below. And this is just a little metal tin that I purchased at an art store in Switzerland. But you can make a travel palette like this with any kind of little metal tin. A lot of people have made them with Altoids tins and that sort of thing. The only thing, and I mentioned this in the video that I've linked below, is that this is not necessarily the ideal container to use because it is so deep. If you can find a container that's a little more narrow in width, that would be ideal because you want something that's not going to be too much higher than your watercolor pans so that you can get in there easier with a brush. So this is the little swatch sheet that tells me where everything is in the palette, but today I'm going to be swatching more thorough swatches in my little swatch book that I have in this traveler's notebook. So I will put a link below to the video where I talk about this traveler's notebook and its setup, but today I am just going to put it aside as soon as I get the swatch book out of here. This is where we're going to be doing our swatches today on this one down here. The next one in the line of swatches is going to be a Lucas palette, but has no Lucas colors. It's just going to be Jackson's colors from Jackson's Art Supply. So stay tuned for that one, but today we're going to be doing this particular travel box. So I need to get my little paintbrush that I have in here, my little travel brush, and then I'm going to put this notebook aside. Okay, so I try to get this organized here so that you can see everything. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that you can see my swatches better. And I will do my best to remember to move the swatch book up when I'm getting to particular swatches so you can see them. And I will just put this, let's see. I try to make it so you can see all the paints, but I think the swatches are the more important thing to have in your view. So I've already pre-labeled all of my colors here, and then I have a little chart here that has a little triad of color that I'm going to mix at the end. If you would like to see the previous videos in this series, I put a link to all of them down below, and each of them will kind of give you a little bit of a sense of what we're doing here. But the long and short of it is I went ahead and stamped these little swatch squares on here with a stamp with permanent ink, and this one is specifically for mixing 3 different colors of a red, blue, and yellow variety. This particular palette is interesting because it's not really a standard color scheme in the palette because I just kind of wanted to play with some different colors that I don't necessarily use very often. So like for instance, you will see I don't have a true red in here. So this is supposed to be a primary triad, but I'm going to have some slightly different colors in my triad this time. So I'll get to that in more detail when we get there, and for now I'm going to swatch the colors that we have here. And you'll notice that I have a little bit of paper on that gray color there, and that is really just because I put this swatch sheet over the top while that was still wet. Probably because I had swatched it and then put it on there, and it just stuck a little bit. You can see, pulled up the paper. So I might try to get that off if I can, but if not, I'll just work around it. And something like that is certainly not devastating or fatal to your watercolors. It's easy to get off eventually. It may take a little scrubbing. Okay, so off camera I have a water container and I have a little paper towel to dab off my brush. So let's go ahead and pre-wet these colors. I've been doing this because it does seem to work pretty well for this format. I've just been putting a little dot of water on each of the colors just to moisten them a little bit before we get going. And that way we don't have to spend too much time scrubbing away at the color to actually get some pigment out of there. Daniel Smith colors, which is, I think all of the colors in here are Daniel Smith. Yes, they are. So Daniel Smith generally re-wets pretty well, so it's not usually that big of a concern. Sorry, I had a little hair in here, which is probably dog hair. Dog hair ends up everywhere for me, so excuse the dog hair. All right, so I'm going to move this out of the view a little bit, and then we'll start with this first one, which is Wisteria. And I may have mentioned in the video that I linked down below for this palette that my original concept for this was to replicate a pre-made palette that Daniel Smith makes that has purples and greens in it. And then once I had some extra space after that, I decided to just add some other colors that I thought would go with those, and just to play around. So as I've said in other videos, what I'm doing here is I'm putting the color fairly full strength up here at the top and then diluting down for each little step here so that we can see the variety of different colors that we will get when diluting the color. And I also put a little black mark here to test the opacity of these watercolors. You'll see Wisteria is a little bit more opaque because it's showing as a little bit of a milky film over that black mark. Okay, and the next color is lavender. And I think I already said, but these are all Daniel Smith colors this time. Okay. And I'm trying not to get too much water in the mix, but sometimes that happens. And sometimes I'll wipe or I'll add more water to the brush, and sometimes I won't. And sometimes this last square ends up really super light. Okay, so the next color is Rose of Ultramarine, which I believe is a mix, because I haven't put the pigment numbers on here, I believe is a mix of Ultramarine Blue and whatever PV19 is, I think. I would have to double check. But it's a really beautiful color. I've tried to mix this color myself, and I just never really get it right. So I kind of like the pre-mixed version. And because there's not a traditional red in this palette, you'll see that this is actually the color that I use in place of red, which should lead to some interesting mixes, potentially some mud, because if you're familiar with color theory at all, if you're mixing colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel, you will get a little bit of a muddy color, or a neutral. Let's just say neutral, because often, even with the neutralized colors that you get with artist grade paints, they're still pretty, I think, and have some use. Okay, so this one is Moon Glow, which I believe is also a mix, but I can't remember what of. A lot of people like Moon Glow. And so far, all of these colors that I've introduced are colors that are in that pre-made palette from Daniel Smith. When they first started releasing their pan colors, they released some pre-curated palettes with certain colors in it, and this is one of the ones they released. So this is Shadow Violet. And I'll let you know when we get beyond the colors that I was replicating in that palette. I think I'll put a link below to that particular palette as well so you can see it. Okay, so then we're moving on to Serpentine Genuine, and I think that this is the last color that is in that curated Daniel Smith palette. So it's kind of interesting. You've got a bunch of purples and green. When I saw they did a little profile on that palette on their website, and they showed all the mixes that you could get from it. They actually looked really pretty, all of the different colors you could get just with this one green and all these different purples. Okay, so after this, these are colors that I have added. I'm going to move this up a little so you can see the swatches. So the next one is Gray Titanium, and this is the one that has that little bit of paper on it. Let's see if I can get that off. It's a little tough. I'm just going to swatch. And this is a very opaque color. And I think this gray titanium is a fairly recent color. That may have been why I got it. I wanted to try it. This next color is also a fairly recent color to Daniel Smith's line. It is Red Jasper Genuine. And whenever you see genuine, it means that that is a genuine mineral that they have used to make the color. Which means this might be in their Primatech line, which I think is the pure mineral line, where you'd find such things as like pure amethyst or Serpentine Genuine is also part of that line. Okay, the next one is Quinacridone Gold. This is one of my favorite yellows, even though it looks more orange. But it makes for a really good warm yellow in your palette. Although after playing with a few different brands of Quinacridone Gold, I think I prefer Schmincke's Quinacridone Gold to Daniel Smith, just because it's a little more subtle. Like I feel like this one is kind of heavy-handed. And Quinacridone Gold used to be a single pigment, but it is no longer available as a single pigment, and now it is a mix of a orange and yellow pigment. So it's a hue, it's Quinacridone Gold hue. So this is Mayan Blue Genuine. So again, part of that Primatech line. And I love this Mayan Blue. This kind of blue is right up my alley, where it's kind of muted and pretty. Pull that up a little bit. And also a very beautiful blue is the Lunar Blue, which is next. A little bit darker than Mayan Blue. And then the last color in here is Lunar Black. Which is a really beautiful granulating black. Okay, so now that we have those down, I'm going to go to my little mixing chart here. Get that a little bit center stage. So like I was saying, because I don't have typical primary type colors in this palette, I'm using Lunar Blue, which is this one right here, for the blue. I'm using Rose of Ultramarine for the red and Quinacridone Gold as the yellow. So it should be interesting. I have never mixed these three colors together, so I'm very interested to see what the mixes will create. So as usual, I'm going to start with red because that's up at the top with that Rose of Ultramarine. I'm going to move this out of the way here. And I'm going to try the top of this container as a mixing area. Actually, let me go ahead and get that ready there. I'm going to try this unfinished or unsurfaced as a mixing area, but I'm not sure how well it will work because usually there should be some kind of coating on there for it to work. But I think that this does have some sort of surface coating. If this doesn't end up working all that well, I will probably put some of my whiteboard sticker material up here on the top because that has been working really, really well as a mixing area that does not stain very well either. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and put in the yellow, which is the Quinacridone Gold. It's off camera in the palette there, I apologize. Okay, trying to work around the area there. Okay, so now I'm going to get what is generally an equal amount of yellow as that is already in here for the Rose of Ultramarine. Yeah, and I suspected that this would result in sort of a brownish color, and that seems to be correct. Because Rose of Ultramarine is, it does have a purple pigment in it, so it leans a little purple, and when you mix purple and yellow, you are going to get a neutral. Okay, and then I'm going to rinse my brush out, and then to get these mixes that have a little bit more red, a little bit more yellow. So I'm using red very liberally here. This is really not a red, but I'm using it as one in my little mixing palette. Okay, so I'm going to mix the Ultramarine, the Rose of Ultramarine. I'm going to mix a little bit more with half of that here and put that here. So basically it's just going to be, you know, that almost seems like a redder brown there. And then with the other half of my puddle, I'm going to add a little bit more Quinacridone Gold and put that here. So we're not getting too much variation, but it's really all kind of a shade of that brown. Okay, I'm going to wipe my mixing area off here. Oh, and that seems to be working okay. The only downside to having this then is that it's silver and not white, because with white you can see the color of the mix a little bit better, but it's okay. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my blue, which is the Lunar Blue. Let me make sure I get that right because I know I have two blues down there. Okay, Lunar Blue. I'm interested to see how this will mix. Okay, a little bit more there. Okay, so then I'm going to put a little puddle in my palette. That one seems to have dried out a little bit. I'm going to put a little puddle of that Lunar Blue in my palette there. Rinse off my brush. I'm going to do the yellow mix first. So I'm going to mix an equal amount, or what seems like an equal amount of that yellow. And here we're getting a green. I think that Lunar Blue might have a little bit of black in it, so it's just going to be a darkened green. That's actually a really beautiful green, I think. Okay, I'm going to rinse off my brush. I'm going to add a little bit more Lunar Blue to half of this puddle here. Might need to do a little bit more. And then we're going to get, oh, do a little bit more. And then we're going to get this more blue toned green. And then I'm going to do the Quinacridone Gold in the other half of the puddle here. Okay. So those are really beautiful, I think. You're not really going to be able to get a true orange out of this mix, although I suppose you can get a brownish orange, because that's kind of what this is. It is an orange tinged brown. Sorry, my little dried out things of paint in the pans were flipping out there. Okay, so now I'm going to do the mix with the blue and the Rose of Ultramarine. So I'm going to put a little puddle of blue here. And you can see it kind of beads. Beading makes it a little bit harder to mix, probably because of the nature of the surface here. And then the Rose of Ultramarine in what I'm thinking is kind of a half and half mix. Okay, so that's looking pretty purple there. There you go, and you end up with a pretty good purple. So I don't have a whole lot of that in here, but I think it's enough for the little squares that I have. So on one half, I'm going to add a little bit more blue. We're definitely going to get this darker purple here. That almost looks like shadow violet, given how dark it is. And I've kind of watered it down a little bit too much, but c'est la vie. Okay, and now I'm going to add a little bit more Rose of Ultramarine to this one. And that's just going to be slightly more blue than the original. I think that's actually a very beautiful triad mix there. So now I'm actually going to take this out of here because there's not really enough to mix. To mix this one in the center, we do an equal amount of both. Or I'm sorry, all three of these primaries. I'm doing my little quotes there. So I'm going to start with the blue. I'm going to put a little puddle of blue. Let me get some more water there. Okay. Blue. I'm going to do the Rose of Ultramarine. Rinse that off. And then I'm going to do the Quinacridone Gold. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more blue. To get to a neutral here, you do kind of have to play with it a little bit, and this has been true of the other mixes I've done. I think that that's pretty good. It's a neutral, but it's still got a little bit of, I would say it's probably a little bit more purple leaning. But you can definitely see it's less orange than the neutral that we have over here. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to go ahead and wipe out this palette. I'm not going to put my swatch sheet on top. I keep getting watercolor on my table here. I'm not going to put my swatch sheet back down on there because I don't want to have a repeat of it sticking to some of the colors. So for now, I'm just going to leave that open to dry. And I'll put that way so you can see. And there we go. So I found that to be a really interesting exercise for mixing these colors. There'll be more interesting color mixes, but I think that this is probably one of the ones that is going to be the most unusual of all the ones that I'm doing. What I also find really interesting is because Lunar Blue is so granulating, you're seeing a little bit of granulation in this mix of Rose of Ultramarine and Lunar Blue. Rose of Ultramarine is also granulating because it's made with ultramarine blue, which is a granulating color. All right, so I think that's it for today. Feel free to like and or subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, bye.